Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining ISQI today for this special online broadcast with the absolutely lovely Sami Kolaru. Hello, Sami.
Hello, nice to meet you.
And you too. Sami, the truth is we've known each other for a little while now, and it's an absolute honour to have you here. Just as a quick introduction, so Sami has been in the software testing industry for, I think, about 17 years, and played a pivotal role in setting up Imbus in Canada. I think also, Sami, you were founder and you're still a board member of TMMI America.
That is right.
And you're going to talk to us today a little bit about the new ISTQB Certified Tester Foundation level and for 4.0. And I understand you're going to decompose it, which has my interest absolutely spiked. So I'm going to go away, Sami, and leave it to you if you don't mind.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you very much for your lovely introduction. And let me bring my screen up. Okay. Debbie, thank you for your introduction. And today's topic basically revolves around the ISTQB's new product portfolio, which is the foundation level, which has been, one of the main product of the ISTQB certification portfolio. But now they came up with a brand new syllabus, which is the version 4. And today's topic, I would like to decompose the foundation level version 4 and then apply some of those concepts that has been discussed in the foundation level into the real world scenarios, especially around the principles, software testing principles. So basically we're going to talk about the principles. We will be introducing the foundation level version 4 and also relevance to the today's industry. Okay. So as we know, one of the core product of the ISTQB is the foundation level, which we talked about. And now they have introduced the brand new syllabus, which is a version 4. I just want to give you a little bit intro into this version 4 syllabus. What is the big change, right? So if you look at the syllabus, the previous and the current syllabus, which has been released very new, most of the contents are still relevant, whether you are certified at the version 3.1 or version 4, which is a new syllabus. The concept, the terminology, the language, the techniques, they're all still relevant. But do those techniques and the approaches, are they still applied to the today's industry? That is where the version 4 comes in. So version 4 not only talks about the traditional approaches of testing, plus they want to bring in the iterative approach of testing, right, which is Agile methodology. So today's webinar, we will deep dive into some of those Agile practices. We will talk about some of the best practices, especially from a testing point of view, and also we'll finish off with the principles of testing. So that will be a wholesome approach in how testing can be introduced into the Agile. So just to introduce some of the syllabus, I'm just focusing on the new concepts from the traditional certification, which is the Foundation 3.1. We did talk about some of the fundamentals, which includes the benefits of testing, some of the skills essential, right? So here in the Agile syllabus with the version 4, we're going to talk about the teams, the roles, and the whole team approach, right? When it comes to the development models, in the version 4, we primarily focus on the traditional sequential model, which includes the V model, waterfall models. But in the version 4, we will focus more into the Agile practices, especially some of the best practices within the Agile framework, which include the feedbacks, frequent feedbacks, different approaches, reporting structure, right, as well as including the collaborations, team structure, collaborations, especially around the three amigos, including business, development, and testing. How do they all three can collaborate and come up with the best value-added user stories that can not only deliver the best value for the organizations, as well as for the testing to deliver the best quality product, right? And also this version 4 introduces various type of tools and new roles, which is a DevOps role, which does not really address in the version 3.1, but in version 3.4, there is a emphasis on DevOps, importance of DevOps, and why some of the tools are necessary in order to deliver the frequently high quality software, especially from the testing deliverables. Okay, so if I want to decompose the version 4, the first would be the deep understanding of software testing, the importance of software testing, what are some of the approaches, which we already talked about that in the previous version, but in the new version 4, they talk about some of the benefits from the agile practices onwards. And when it comes to strategy, some of the test principles, the policies around around the testing, the strategies as well as approaches. All the strategy we had discussed in the previous version, they are still relevant. Again, we want to enhance them with the today's industry standards, which is the agile practices. And we will talk about some of those practices, if not all, in this session. Again, the whole purpose of this foundation level, as we know by now, is not only to make you a better tester. We want us as a testing team to become a very efficient and effective software tester. Applying some of the ISTQB principles and some of the agile practices would I wouldn't say guarantee us, will ensure us that we will become effective and efficient software testers. And to prove that all, we have this ISTQB certification that can give us the validation that yes, we do understand the process and the best practices. At the same time, we implement the practices that can make us better, efficient and effective software testers. And finally, from a management point of view, of course, the management of the test process, including the planning, monitoring, taking corrective actions, communications are very key when it comes to delivering information, which is necessary to make a decision in order to release the product. And the foundation level 4 does talk about various communication techniques and methods and tools, which I will also talk about that very briefly in this session. And again, insights, teamworks, skills, training, those are all good emphasis in order to develop a high quality software testers, right? Again, tools, very, very important. In version 3.1, they do introduce, ISTQB does introduce some of the generic tools, but in this version 4, we will talk about some specific tools that could be used, especially when we are talking in an agile environment or agile ecosystems. So I will try to introduce some of the tools, very generic tools. I may not talk about specific tools, but I will talk about the benefits of using certain types of tool in certain frameworks. Okay, so if you look at the decomposing the version 4 syllabus, we talk about some of the best practices, some of the strategies, ensuring the effectiveness and efficiency of using the test approaches, communication, which is key, teamwork, and finally using tools. Okay, so my today's webinar would be focused on these 6 items or topics. Okay, so let's start with the generic one. What is testing? Right, very generic. We all know, we all use softwares on a daily basis, and we use softwares either to solve some of our own industrial problems, right? Or we can use the software to gather some information so that we can make decisions. And you might have experienced by now, not all softwares are made perfect, right? There is nothing called the best software in the world. Every software, regardless of how big the industry you are and how small you are, each software has its own problem or own risk. And how do we manage those risks is very important. And that is why testing is very essential to ensure the quality of the software is maintained, at the same time to deliver the business value to our customers, right? So software testing itself, it's a technique, and also it is an intellectual activity, right? You're not only following certain sequence of activities, you're also coming with the different scenarios, different ways your customer can benefit from using your software to solve their business problems. If you think about software testing approaches, right? For those who have not been in the software testing industry, we do know there are certain processes involved. At a high level, if you think about how does the testers do, right? I'm not talking about any specific methodology or any specific framework. In general, we as a test team or users in this case, we will use a software just like anybody else would use, right? In order to solve our own problems or our business problems. While using the problem, we might encounter some risk, some issues, some anomalies or defects, we might call them, right? So those are the defects that will stop us from delivering our values. What do we do next? As a software testing team, we have to report to somebody who can find a best way to resolve that anomalies or a risk. That means we're going to report to the development team. As a development team, they are focused into developing a software. That is why we call it as a debugging. It's a constructive approach. It is a development activity where they would come up with the best way to solve the problem. As a test team, we identified the problem. Now, development team, they would come up with a different ways to resolve them. That means to find the root cause in the defect. So once a developer identifies the defects, now developer will fix them. This is a very high level over. It's like looking at the entire process from 10,000 feet high, right? So this is the overall view. Now, within this process, there are certain practices, certain techniques, and certain approaches that you can implement, which we're going to talk about that. So talking about the testing, as we know by now, as I mentioned earlier, testing is a methodical approach. Yes, it is a technical approach. It is an engineering approach. At the same time, it is also an intellectual approach. You're not only following a sequential activities where you do step one, go to step two. At the same time, you have to consider your end user in mind, and also you have to consider the business profile, right? What type of product you're working with and who is the end user. That means if you want to be a good tester, to become a good efficient tester, you have to have a specialist skill in the domain that you're working on, whether it's a banking domain, health related products, or just a business products, business tools, right? And also you need to have a good analytical skills. So critical thinking is very important. Systematically delving the complex business problem into simple tasks so that it's easy to manage, easy to find solutions. It is also very important. And also there are other various soft skills that might be necessary, like communication, being curious, being skeptical. Those are all very important skills to have. But of course, domain knowledge is very important. At the same time, systematic thinking is also very important, right? Talking about the testing, remember, as I said earlier, testing, it's engineering. That is, you have a methodical approaches that you have to follow, right? For example, you have to have a planning. When it comes to planning, the previous version 3.1 does introduce these approaches. It is a very similar approach. It is a very standardized approach in software testing, right? There is a planning involved. There is analysis of the documentations, test bases, designing your test conditions, implementing your environments, executing your test, and finally completing your test. This is very built-in traditional approaches. Now, what is new with the version 4? With the version 4, we're going to talk about various stakeholders involved, right? We are not just talking from a testing point of view. We are talking about business stakeholders, development stakeholders, management stakeholders, right? We are not only specifically talking from testing. We are talking as a whole team approach. So that is a new concept you're going to learn from the version 4. And talking about the analysis and design, which is again borrowed from the previous version, the 3.1 version. But what changed here? We're going to talk about team members. Who is involved? Is it only testing team that is involved in, creating a test conditions and designing test cases? No, again, as I said, it is a whole team approach. That means development team, business team can all collaborate together and come up with the best possible scenarios. That means you need to have a good skills in terms of delving complex business problem into simple solutions, and also having experience in the domain and also necessary training. Just like one of us, we are specialized in training software testing courses, as specializing in the ISTQB certifications. And talking about the domain, during execution and implementation, it is necessary to have certain type of domain knowledge, regardless of the industry, right? It is good to have technical knowledge, technical skills, analytical skills, which is soft skills, and also domain skills is very important as well, right? Depending on what industry you work for. Not all skills or all techniques are relevant to all types of domains. You have to tweak them, you have to customize them based on whether it's a safety critical product, whether it is a simple e-commerce product, or it's my personal blog, which nobody reads, and it really doesn't need to do all type of test you might want to perform, right? Again, we will talk about that, the importance of selecting certain type of test, right? And completion, ensuring the product is available in the production or in the operations, ensuring that it meets the customer's expectation, which is very, very crucial, right? Again, when it comes to planning, this is again which has been talked about in the previous version as well, talking about the scope and objectives, talking about different practices and different techniques that can be used, especially around the strategy, around the quality agenda, using different types of development lifecycle. If you have taken the course or training with the 3.1 version, we primarily talk about the sequential model, which is the using the waterfall or the V model. But here we're going to focus more into the Agile framework. And of course, as I said earlier, 2 tools, making best of the tools, trying to avoid some of the redundancy or repetitive work would be very, very beneficial, especially when you use the tools, right? So going back to the sequential, I'm not going to talk about more because we already talked about this in the previous version. But as I said, all the knowledge, all the skills you learned in the previous training or previous version, they are still applicable. Especially if you have learned different techniques and different processes in a sequential model. Example could be waterfall V model. They are still relevant. Whether you're using whether you're working on Agile projects or whether you're working sequential, it doesn't matter. The knowledge, the skills you gain, they are reusable, right? And also iterative model, rational unified process. These are all the techniques you might have learned in the previous versions. But again, as I said, those techniques you learned, they are still applicable, but we have to customize them according to our needs. That is Agile practices. This is where we want to bring in some of the best practices Agile can use, right? So normally we would have heard most of the the development team or test team, they talk about Agile. I work in Agile projects. Agile itself, it's a big ocean, I would say, right? Within Agile, there are a number of practices you can use them. Not all practices are relevant for all types of industries. As I said, you have to customize your techniques and strategy based on the domain that you're working in, right? For example, the new version, which is a version 4, foundation level version 4, they introduced the concept of ATDD, which is acceptance test driven development, right? Which is if you think about it, it is very relevant today, right? You do not want to build a product only based on the functionality, whether A plus B gives me C. That is not relevant anymore, right? Today's business needs value. Whatever functionality you build, whatever product you build, does it serve my purpose, right? Those days used to be where, as a user, I would adapt to the software. Whatever the software provides is what I would use them as my value. But going forward, the software is developed not based on the functionalities, based on the business value that can deliver to my needs. In this competitive world, it is very, very important to develop a software based on acceptance test. That means acceptance test is one of those collaborative approaches between the developers, testing team, business team. We collaboratively decide what is best, what are some of the acceptance tests this has to perform, and the development is designed around those acceptance tests, right? Again, as I said, we are developing around the business value rather than just a functional values. Again, there's another approaches, another practices, which is very, very common, which is very relevant today. And the version 4.0 talks very, very deeply into this technique, which is behavior-driven development, which is very relevant for today's market. Behavior-driven development, again, we are developing a software not purely based on the coding, rather than based on the behavior. What should my software do when, as a user, if we interact with the software in a certain manner, right? And normally they define in given, when, then format. The version 4 talks very deeply into different ways of defining your behavior-driven development. And depending on the industry, we have other best practice, other Agile practices, which is called domain-driven development. In domain-driven development, it builds a relationship between the complex relationship between the technology and the infrastructure, right? Again, it is relevant to certain types of industries, and Agile meets those demands as well. For example, if you want to develop some kind of test infrastructure for telecom industries or insurance companies, then we have a domain-driven development that can cater to specific type of industries. And there are many other practices practices available, for example, extreme programming, which is very not very commonly used, but it is used at certain circumstances, especially if you want to develop a software based on the feedback you get from your production, based on feedback you get from your end users, right? Rather than developing a product and then asking the user to use them, instead you wait for the user to give you a feedback. Based on their demand, we can develop a software. So that provides much better value to the customer. So extreme program is one of those methodology or one of the practices which is not widely used, but it is extremely useful when you use them in a very confined, very controlled manner, right? We cannot just develop a product entirely based on the reactive approach. That means you're waiting for some kind of feedback, which you may or may not receive them, but we have to somehow combine or complement extreme programming into other agile practices. Some of them we just talked about, right? Acceptance test driven or business test behavior test driven. One of the most common one, which is widely practiced, is the feature driven development. It is again another agile practices where you're developing a software based on the business values. Remember, I keep talking about business value. That is how the software will be built from going forward. Rather than building a software and asking customer to use them, we ask the customer, what do you need? How can we solve your problem? And then we build the product around their needs. That is called feature driven. And one of the one of the best practices or one of the agile practices is a feature driven development, which version 4 extensively talks about some of the feature driven techniques. And of course, Kanban, we all might have used them, right? One of the very simple agile practices, and it's very visual practices. If you look at the picture, it's what do I need to do, what is in progress, and what is complete, right? Very visual, very easy to understand. And again, as I said, this type of practices can be complemented when we combine with other practices such as feature-driven development. And we have a lean IT where you develop the product based on the continuous improvements, right? Rather than building entire functionality, you build based on the demand. And Scrum, this is the one practice that I would like to spend a little bit more time on talking about some of the processes, which I will talk about that in another slide. Again, Scrum itself is a framework where the software is developed in an iterative and incremental manner. Rather than developing the entire project, you develop them in few functionalities, learn lessons from those functionalities, and then develop more on top of it and stop building them on top of it iteratively, right? And finally, there is a technical practices, which is very relevant for today's environment, especially with so much technology and tools available. Test-driven development. Rather than developing a software and testing later, now we are going to switch our mindset. We will build a test, and then develop the software based on the test. Again, the mindset has been it's a little bit different. That means when I say write a test and then develop, that means I'm talking from a quality perspective. Rather than developing a product and then thinking about quality agenda later in the cycle, which could be a little too late, now we are developing a software with a quality in mind, and then ensuring the development meets those quality agenda. Right? So these are some of the practices we will talk during our version 4 syllabus. This is, again, as I said, it's a very high-level overview. You get the idea of what are the practices available. In the realistic world, in the real projects, we are not talking about using all those practices for every single project. You got to pick and choose what is most relevant for your industry. Remember the domain, and also what practices will add most value to your organization. Okay, and again, talking about all those practices, do not forget that all the techniques you might have learned from your previous versions, especially around the black box techniques, such as equivalence, boundary value, decision tables, or state transitions, those techniques are still relevant, regardless of whether you're working on the sequential model or on the agile model. Right? So again, based on these black box techniques, we are going to add few more agile practices on top of it to make our test more efficient and more effective. Experience, of course, will add tremendous value to our business, right? And in previous versions of foundation level, they do talk about experience-based technique. Again, those skills are transferred into the Agile methodology, especially with the foundation level version 4. We do talk about various type of techniques that are still relevant, such as error guessing, checklist-based testing, which we might have learned them. And also we are going to talk about exploratory testing. Again, it's a reactive-based testing. Right? Rather than we testing based on documentations, or rather than testing based on the available knowledge, we use our own experience. We use our own skills, our own curiosity to design a test based on the user's value. Okay. So again, with the foundation level 4, they have various concepts and practices that talks about different types of experience-based testing, primarily focusing on these three techniques. And exploratory is very relevant, and most organizations do practice exploratory testing, and it would be a very good idea to adapt the skills to explore the software based on the reactive approach rather than having a planned approach, right? Again, as I said, I have to spend a little bit time on the Agile methodology, especially around the Scrum framework. In today's industry, when you ask any development team, that means developers and testers included, when they say we are working on Agile projects, 80% of them would say it is a Scrum. Remember, as I said earlier, there are various practices available in Agile, and Scrum is one of those practices. And 80% of them are using Scrum projects, right? When they say Agile, they typically mean Scrum. Again, with the Scrum, you can have other practices, for example, Kanban, which I talked about, or the XP, extreme programming. These are the other practices you can add on top of the Scrum framework, so that your testing and that product development would be wholesome, right? So talking about the Scrum framework, for those who may not be aware of how the process would be within the Scrum framework, normally there would be a business owner. Remember, we are talking about three amigos: business, development, and testing. So business are responsible for creating a backlog. Backlogs are nothing but a group of user stories that can deliver the value. Again, whenever I talk about requirements or a business or the user stories, I talk from a business value, right? So user stories that can deliver the values. As a team, as a whole team, we ensure that user stories are easy to read, testable, estimatable, right? You need to know how much to test and to what extent you want to test, right? Once you as a team, you agree that the user stories have all the relevant information necessary. For example, we call them as acceptance criteria. Then we prioritize them based on the sprints. Sprints are nothing but a weekly cycle or bi-weekly cycle, depending on your organizations. We prioritize them based on the business values. During a sprint means it could be a 2-week cycle, it could be a 4-week cycle, depending on the organizations. Let's say, for argument's sake, it is a 2-week cycle. That means a development team and test team will develop the product, which is a high priority business value, within those 2-week cycle. And there is a continuous feedback, frequent feedback, and we call them as a daily stand-up. Right? This feedback can be given on a daily basis. So once the sprint has been completed, then we would ensure the user story meets the business value, that is the definition of done. And then finally, we can ship it to the customer. The process is very simple, right? You will start from the business value, and we deliver that business value. In the meantime, we ensure that these business values will follow some of the Agile practices, which we have introduced earlier, Scrum, or Kanban, or the Lean, right? Whatever practice you choose, they all fall within this framework. Again, when we talk about the approaches, how do we approach our testing? How do we decide how much test we need to do? And the foundation level version 4 has a very detailed chapter that talks about test pyramid. Test pyramid is, again, it's an abstract concept, right? It kind of gives an overview of what test you need to do when and to how much. For example, let's use one popular model. This is the pyramid, and we have a unit testing, which is one of the simplest tests. What this pyramid is trying to tell you is, if you look at the surface area, for component test takes most of the area. That means when you're performing unit testing, you need to do more of the unit testing to get reasonable coverage of a test. That means you have to do lots of small tests to ensure that you get reasonable coverage. When it comes to integration testing, you need to do lots of integration testing between those components to get a reasonable coverage. When you're testing from a user's point of view or end-to-end point of view, or even you can call them as a usability point of view, you need few tests. And those tests are typically very long tests, right? We are talking from a user's point of view. For example, user log into the system, they navigate through different screens, and then until they log out. That means they have an entire business logic. We need a few of those business logics to ensure good coverage, right? So test pyramid gives an overview of how much test we need to do, what level of test we need to do, and to what extent. It gives you that granularity. So the foundation level 4 talks about the pyramid and what's the importance of pyramid in order to understand how much test and to what extent you can test them, right? It's more of a guide. And also foundation level 4 talks about quadrants, testing quadrants. Testing quadrant is again a visual concept where it defines what type of test we need to do, by whom it has to be done, what type of technique we can use, and whether do you want to automate them or run them manually. So testing quadrant is again a visual concept that defines the relationship between the techniques, the roles, and the approach. For example, I'll be very quick with this one. Quadrant 1, let's start with a very basic quadrant. Quadrant 1, it's a white box, which is mainly done by the development team. Primarily, you will be doing the unit testing, component testing, or integration testing. That means this test can be done by automation tools. When it comes to quadrant 2, which will support the team and the business value, that means this could be done using a black box technique. And some of the examples of black box technique you can use is, use functional testing, decision tables, or user stories, or user experience testing. Right? Again, this is done by the testing team. That can be done either by manual or automation or combined. And if you look at the quadrant 3, we are talking from a business value point of view, and also we're critiquing the product. In that case, we can consider some of the experience-based techniques, which is exploratory testing, user acceptance testing. Again, this can be done by testing team or even the business team, and this has to be done manually. Finally, when we're talking about from a technology point of view and criticizing the product, that means we're talking from a product's performance-wise, that is non-functionality, such as performance, response time, security. That means this can be done by testing team and primarily using tools. So the quadrant talks about the relationship between the different types of techniques, the roles, strategies, and the approach. Right? So it gives you the wholesome approach of how to adapt the testing to your environment, to your domain. So the version 4 talks extensively about the quadrants as well. And again, as I said, the whole team is very, very important, ensuring that as a test team, we are one of the team members in the Agile projects. That means we work closely with the team members to ensure the desired quality is achieved, regardless of whether it's a product or whether the document or the product itself. We are responsible for the quality. More than responsible, we are the torch bearer for the quality. When it comes to quality, it is the entire team's responsibility. Everyone in the project is involved with the quality, but we as a test team, we are the one who guides our team into the quality culture. That means collaborate with the business representatives to define some of the acceptance test from a business value point of view, work with the developers to create some automation test. Remember, I talked about test-driven development, where you create test before development starts. We as a test team can collaborate with the development team to come up with those tests where developer can build quality while developing the software. Knowledge transfer, introducing the quality culture into organization. These are all responsibility that would belong to testing team, and we as a testing team will play a major role when it comes to the whole team approach. Not to forget about early testing, which is, we call them as a shift left approach. If you look at the graph, if you consider the traditional approach, which is what the version 3.1 extensively talks about, testing normally comes very late in the cycle, right? So this is the early cycle where you start with a plan, and this is the deployment. Normally, testing is done after the development is completed, and then testing would start. That means if you look at the efforts, the efforts are very high and the cost could be very high, right? In terms of defects, if you find them and fix them, it could be very high. So in the version 4, we talk about shift left approach, that is testing very early in the cycle. That means rather than waiting until the end of the project or towards the end of the project, start very early, even with the reviewing the documents, performing the test-driven development, which I introduced a few slides ago, introducing the non-functional testing very early rather than later in the cycle, introducing very early, and also performing end-to-end testing very early in the cycle, right? So rather than waiting until the end of the project, we are going to shift left. Not only by using the shift left approach, we are finding the defects very early, it also saves tremendous money for the project. Again, that is one of the objective of the testing, is to ensure the project is developed within the estimated cost or within the budget. And shift left approach will ensure that we find the defects very early in the cycle, which can lead to saving money to the project. Right? And again, the version 4 talks extensively about the shift left approach. Again, this is one of the slide I have just to showcase the real world example of how much money a company can save by adapting a shift left approach. Right? For example, I'm not going to talk about this. Look at the defects that is found, right? When you're during planning stage, they might find 10% defects, 3% defects. I'm talking about defect detection. During testing stage, we find about 75% of the defects, right? Look at the cost of fixing those defects. If you find and fix the defect within your planning and design stage, it's much cheaper to fix. If you wait until the customer finds them, it is much more expensive to fix. That is why testing early is very, very important, especially when you compare the dollar values, right? If you find them and fix them very early in the cycle, it costs about $250. Don't quote me this value because this is the value that is universally accepted. But if you find those defects in the production, that the same defect might cost over $12,000, which because you have to redo the entire process of analyzing, developing, testing, right? And everything would cost money. All those additional process will cost money. Hence, testing early is very, very important. And the version 4.0 emphasis heavily on the early testing and early feedback. And at the same time, keeping the independence of testing separate from the development team. Agile talks about collaborative testing, collaborative approach. But again, when we talk about collaboration, there should be a certain degree of independence between the testing and the development. So keeping all this in mind, there are a couple of best practices I would like to discuss about from a testing point of view. So we talked about some of the agile practices, some of the traditional techniques, but as a testing team, what are some of the best practices we can follow to ensure that we add value to the quality agenda? The one quality is one practices would be to ensure there is a testing activity for every development activity. When you build a product, it has to be tested. When you develop a quality into the product, it has to be developed based on the quality. That means for every development activity, there should be a corresponding testing activity. As a test team, we are the one who's responsible to ensure there is a quality built into the product by ensuring that there is a testing activity involved for every development activities, regardless of how big or small the functionality would be. And the next best practice is to select different types of test or different levels of test with an objective. Do not test just for the sake of testing. Ensure any test you select add business value. That means have an objective. Why are you testing them? What is the purpose of it? And then design a test around those objectives, right? And also avoid redundancy as much as possible, right? Again, testing with business value will make you most efficient and effective tester because you're adding business related value to the organization. Again, talking about early testing, which I talked earlier, one of the best practices is to ensure that you're testing very early in the cycle. That means you're testing them as soon as you are introduced into the project, as soon as the documentation, some kind of documentations or designs are available. That gives you enough information regarding the upcoming projects. And as a test team, you start preparing all the necessary the work products from the testing point of view, right? Rather than waiting until all the informations are available, start from gathering those information, start gathering the work products from the get-go. And remember, as a test team, we are just not a representative of quality. We are also representative of making sure the requirements, documentations, user stories, they're high quality. At the same time, they're complete, right? So testing team can be involved in reviewing all the work products, not only from a development point, also from a business work products as well. Right. So these are some of the best quality test practices that as a test team, I believe you should follow in order to become efficient, effective tester. At the same time, there are a number of soft skills that we can utilize. Right. I think I introduced this already. Again, this is very generic, but they are still relevant for the software industry. For example, my favorite would be domain knowledge. You have to be active listener, have a good communication, curiosity that will add very high value to the project, and critical thinking is very, very important as well. Right. Risk. Again, every project has its own risk. Understanding the risk, right? Risk is part of the project. Understanding those risks and ensuring that the risk is considered while developing a product, right? Again, risk, you have to manage them so that you can, achieve the objective of testing, ensure the product quality has been achieved, as well as at the same time, you want to increase the confidence of your project stakeholders. So assuming that risk is already in the system, you have to develop your product based on those risks. Once you identify those risks, once you manage those risks, you can utilize risk-based testing to ensure that we minimize the risk to the reasonable level. Remember, as I said, testing is not a process where we can find all the risk in the software. Our goal is not to find all the risk in the software. Our goal is to find the risk in the software that impacts the business values the most, right? We are not here to find every single risk, every single type of defects. We want to find the defects that can add more value to the product. That means once we reduce the risk of these defects, that means the value of the product will increase tremendously. Again, the reason I'm talking about this, we are not only talking about verification, that is the product is complete, we are also talking from a validation, whether it really meets my purpose from a user's point of view. And communications is very key. As I said, one of the soft skills is communications, especially in agile projects. Communication is the key, and the agile projects talk about, the version 4 talks about various type of communications available, right? Going back to the principles, I want to introduce the principles, and today's topic is more about around the principles. There are 7 principles which is discussed in this software, in this version 4, which is also talked about in the version 3.1 as well. The first principle says testing shows presence of defects, right? As I mentioned earlier, our job is not to find only defects. We want to minimize the risk. That means if you test a product, you will find the defects. There is no guarantee that testing will prove that there are no defects in the software, right? So always, whenever you're testing them, ensure that your goal is to identify any risk that can impact the business value. And the second principle says exhaustive testing is not possible. That means do not try to attempt to test everything, every single possible combinations and permutations. Our testing should be around the business value and around the risk. Again, I keep repeating business value. That is what the test would be going forward. Rather than testing purely based on the functionality, we are going to test based on the business value. When one of the principles clearly suggests that not to attempt to test everything, rather test based on the business value and based on the risk. And the third principle, of course, we talked about this already. Early testing will save time and also money. And I already showed you some of the dollar value that can be saved for the organizations. And fourth principle talks about clusters, defect clusters. Whenever a defect cluster is a good concept of understanding where you can find most defects, right? Remember, one of the key of the foundation of our syllabus is to understand what's the objective of testing, at the same time ensuring that we maintain efficiency and effectiveness. Defect cluster will guide us where to focus most, what area is more complex, what area might have potential defects, and focusing all your testing efforts into those areas, right? Again, risk-based testing is very, very useful when you want to identify the defect clusters in your software, right? Cluster defect focused on in one single area. Again, complexity, business value will help you identify the clusters. Again, test wear out. This is one of the important principles that we need to understand, right? As a testing team, we tend to repeat the same test again and again with the same type of data or environment. And we have that false impression that the product is of high quality because we repeated the same test for 10 different times and we got the same results. This could be a misconception. When you repeat the same test again, you are not expecting any new information. If you're looking for any certain new information, new defect, new risk, you have to change something, either the data, the environment, the test script, right? Something has to be changed. Only exception is that if you're doing a regression testing. If you're doing regression, then yes, you want to repeat the same test. You want to get the same results for the same type of inputs. That's the one exception. And of course, in the version 4 syllabus, we talk extensively about automation. And context, we talked about this already. Do not try to simulate the same type of test for every single domain. You have to customize your test approach, customize the practices, some of the agile practices, depending on the domain. One example I used is, if you're testing a healthcare product, a finance risk project, yes, you might have to consider different levels of test. But if you're talking about my personal blog, which really nobody cares, in that case, I wouldn't be considering all the different practices, right? So you have to customize based on the domains. And finally, fallacy. This is very, very important to understand. Fallacy is a mistaken belief that, hey, if I have all the functionalities available in my product, my customer will start using them. Those were the days that used to be where functional product is defined by the functionalities. Going forward, the products are defined by the business values, right? So it's a fallacy that if you have all the functionalities, everything is working as per expected, our customers will start using them. That is not true anymore. Your customer will only use them, it will serve their purpose. That means we are not only focusing on verification, we are also validating from the business perspective, right? Okay, these are all the things I want to introduce for today's session. And I really appreciate you for paying attention for this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sami. That was such a comprehensive overview of what's in the 4.0, what differentiates it from the previous version 3.1, but not only just what differentiates it, but what really kind of makes it stand out. Just a point I'd like to make very quickly, and I know that we'll try to share this a bit more broader into the community if we can. The current version of the ISTQB Foundation level, which is 3.1, will retire on the 9th of May in English. Okay. Now, that's a hard stop, and we have no way around it. It means that anybody who wants to retake an exam or whatever, after the 9th of May in English, I can't do it. For other languages, we do have a little bit of extra time up until the 9th of November, but again, then it will be a hard stop. So I think that was such a helpful overview, Sami. Can I also just say, sorry, I'm talking a lot here, that IMBUS Canada are an accredited training provider, and that's really quite important to take note of for anybody who is thinking about doing any formal training. Of course, you can self-study, and there's a syllabus and sample exams available. But if someone is thinking, you know what, I'm wanting to know a bit more about what Sami said here, and I'd like to do a formal training course, please make sure you look for accredited training. That means it's been assessed by the ISTQB. Just a few comments here. Evelyn, thank you very, very much. A nice overview and a nice recap. That's super. Thank you so much. Mana, thanks a lot. That's lovely. Jacques, are there any specific questions there that have been raised? Okay. How can CTFL 4 enhance test efficiency and effectiveness?
Of course. Remember, as I said, the whole idea of the CTFL 4 is to develop a product from business value. So CTFL 4 addresses most of those efficiency and effectiveness that one. Some of them is the practices we talked about, agile practices. We introduced some of those practices. Again, as a test team, if we implement some of those practices, those are technical practices on top of the some soft skills we talked about, curiosity, learning, training. Those are all additional practices that we can learn that could make us better in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. CTFL 4 is very good in terms of delivering the values. And how do we ensure that we deliver our values by having all those practices implemented?
That's great. Jacques, I think we've got time for one more question, maybe. We're kind of approaching the top of the hour, but let's go for it. What are the essential skills required for supporting professional development and team building? So it's a bit of a broader question, but
it is. I think we already covered most of them, but maybe I'll give you a very high overview. Some of the skills we talked about already. I think I talked about in the slides as well. Remember, we talked about domain.
Yes.
Understanding not only testing using all the generic techniques, we have to understand what type of techniques we need to use depending on the domain. Again, that is very important skill to have, is understanding the domain. What are you testing? Why are you testing? That is called objectives, right? The CTFL 4 is very, very good at developing those objectives, and catering your test around those objectives is very important. Again, on top of that, remember talking about whole team approach. Developing a software is not a standalone activity. It's an entire team, and I kept mentioning 3 amigos. That means business, development, and testing. So we as a test team should gain enough skill to work with the team environment, right? So again, the CTFL 4 does talk about number of skills. In this webinar, I think I might have mentioned few of them, but the various skills that you can enhance, and we during the training we do have some of the practices we do practice in the class to ensure that our students will adapt some of those skills when they go back to their professional field. Again, going to what are the essential, I'll just give you a very high overview. Technical skills are very important, especially around the agile practices. Soft skills are very, very important, especially around the whole team approach, communications, and also tools. Ensure that there are a number of tools available, and Agile emphasize on using those tools, and practicing those tools, using those tools as a part of your daily activities would be very, very essential skills to have.
Perfect. We are over time, so thank you very, very much. Sami, I'm sure that if anybody's got any specific queries, they can send you a LinkedIn message, and I know you'd be very, very pleased to help, or please do contact ISTQB and we'll be able to pass that on to Sami. Thank you so much again. Really valuable time and a valuable overview, so it's appreciated.
Yeah. That's wonderful, and thank you for this opportunity. And I look forward to seeing any additional questions, and I'll find some time to respond to them either on LinkedIn or by emails that you might have on file.
Super. Thank you, Sami. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Take care.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.